As dusk settled over the suburbs of San Francisco, Elizabeth Parker gazed out the window of her home. At over 60, her face bore the gentle wrinkles of a life well lived. Elizabeth, who had worked as a teacher for many years, now spent her days volunteering since retirement. "It's already 5 o'clock," she murmured as she made her way to the kitchen. While preparing dinner, her thoughts drifted to her daughter Sarah, her husband Mark, and their 10-year-old granddaughter Sophie. Her relationship with Sarah had grown cold over the past few years. Sarah's words, "Mom, stop meddling in our lives," echoed in Elizabeth's ears. Sarah tended to interpret Elizabeth's parenting advice as criticism. Elizabeth let out a deep sigh. "If only Sarah and I could talk things through a bit more, for Sophie's sake." Thinking of Sophie brought a soft smile to Elizabeth's face. Bright and curious Sophie was Elizabeth's only grandchild. However, Sarah and Mark had limited Elizabeth's visits, so opportunities to see Sophie were few and far between. The last time she'd seen Sophie was a month ago. During a picnic in the park, Sophie had snuggled up to Elizabeth and whispered, "Grandma, I wish I could see you more." Those words had tugged at Elizabeth's heartstrings, but there wasn't much she could do. After finishing dinner, Elizabeth sat on the sofa, watching TV in the living room. Seeing the happy families on screen, she couldn't help but think about her own family. If only things were a little better with Sarah. The thought crossed her mind. But Elizabeth quickly brushed it aside. "I can only do what I can do now," she reminded herself. Before bed, Elizabeth gazed at a photo of Sophie. "Good night, Sophie. Grandma is always thinking of you," she said softly. That night, Elizabeth was plagued by an unsettling dream. In the dream, Sophie was calling out to her for help. The next morning, Elizabeth woke up earlier than usual. Perhaps due to the dream, she felt somewhat uneasy. As she went through her morning routine, she couldn't stop thinking about Sophie. At 9:30 a.m., just after finishing breakfast, the phone suddenly rang. Seeing Sarah's name on the caller ID, Elizabeth hesitated for a moment but quickly picked up the receiver. "Mom." Sarah's voice was trembling. "Sophie. Sophie is missing." Elizabeth caught her breath. "What? Since when?" "Since yesterday evening. She didn't come home from school," Sarah answered, her voice on the verge of breaking down. The unsettling dream from the night before flashed through Elizabeth's mind. "Have you contacted the police?" "Yes, but..." Sarah's voice trailed off. "Mom, could you come over? Please." It had been a while since Sarah had made such a request. Elizabeth answered without hesitation, "I'll be right there." 30 minutes later, Elizabeth arrived at Sarah and Mark's house. Sarah, who opened the door, was pale, her eyes red from crying. "Mom, thank you for coming," Sarah embraced Elizabeth. Entering the living room, Mark was talking with a police officer. Elizabeth observed Mark's demeanor. He looked tired, but there was something oddly calm about him. The police officer turned to Elizabeth and began to explain. "We're currently searching the surrounding area. We're also questioning Sophie's friends and teachers." Elizabeth nodded and asked, "Is there anything I can do to help?" "Yes, could you provide us with a recent photo of Sophie and tell us about her recent behavior?" Elizabeth provided Sophie's latest photo and gave a detailed account of Sophie's demeanor when they last met. All the while, she carefully observed Sarah and Mark's reactions. Sarah continued to cry, but there was something off about Mark's attitude. He seemed unnaturally calm. After the police officer left, Elizabeth asked Sarah and Mark, "Has there been any change in Sophie's behavior recently?" Sarah shook her head. "Not really." However, Elizabeth didn't miss the momentary tension in Mark's expression. For the rest of the day, Elizabeth joined Sarah and Mark in searching the neighborhood. By evening, they hadn't found any leads on Sophie's whereabouts. Back at home, Elizabeth sank into a chair, exhausted. However, her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. Sophie's disappearance, Sarah and Mark's unnatural behavior, and last night's unsettling dream. "Sophie, where are you?" Elizabeth whispered, staring into the darkness outside the window. "Grandma will surely find you." At that moment, Elizabeth didn't know that this event would dramatically change her life. A week had passed since Sophie's disappearance. Elizabeth had been spending sleepless nights by the phone. During the day, she participated in search efforts, and at night, she was consumed by worry. On this night too, Elizabeth sat sleepless on the living room sofa. The clock showed 2 a.m. Outside, a gentle rain was falling. Suddenly, she heard a faint knock. Elizabeth jumped up and hurried to the door. At this hour, she thought as she opened it, revealing an unbelievable sight. A small figure stood there, soaked by rain and covered in mud. On closer look, it was Sophie. But she looked nothing like the Sophie Elizabeth knew. "Sophie!" Elizabeth gasped. Sophie's clothes were in tatters, her hair tangled, and her face was scratched. Above all, her eyes were filled with fear. "Grandma!" Sophie's voice trembled. "Help me, please." Elizabeth immediately embraced Sophie and brought her inside. "It's okay, Sophie. Grandma's here now." While holding Sophie, Elizabeth reached for her cell phone. "I need to contact Sarah." But suddenly, Sophie grabbed Elizabeth's hand. "No. Grandma, please. Don't call Mom and Dad." Sophie's eyes were filled with fear and desperation. Elizabeth was confused but, seeing her granddaughter's state, put down the phone for now. "All right, Sophie." "But why?" Sophie began to speak in a shaky voice. "Dad and Mom. Dad and Mom." She stumbled over her words and began to cry. Elizabeth gently hugged Sophie, trying to calm her. "Take your time, sweetie. Grandma's right here." After a while, Sophie seemed to calm down a bit. Elizabeth went to the kitchen and brought back some warm milk and cookies. "Here, eat this first. Then we'll talk slowly, okay?" Sophie looked at Elizabeth with grateful eyes and slowly began to eat. After finishing, Sophie took a deep breath and started to speak. "Dad and Mom, they hit me. Sometimes, they don't give me food." Elizabeth gasped. In her mind, past events flashed by like a slideshow. Sarah and Mark's unnatural behavior, Sophie's previous demeanor, everything started to make sense. Sophie continued. "They said my grades at school were bad, but I was really trying my best. But Dad and Mom got angry. Her words pierced Elizabeth's heart. That day, when I came home from school, Dad was really angry. I got scared and ran away. Where did you go? Elizabeth gently asked. At first, I slept in the park. But it was cold, so I went to my classmate Jake's house. Jake's mom let me stay there. Elizabeth was moved by Sophie's courage. A 10-year-old girl, trying so hard to survive. But I couldn't stay there forever, and I remembered you. Sophie held Elizabeth's hand. I thought you would help me. Elizabeth hugged Sophie tightly. You did well to come here, Sophie. Grandma will protect you, no matter what. As she felt Sophie relax in her arms, Elizabeth's resolve solidified. She was determined to face anything to protect her granddaughter. Sophie, rest here tonight. Tomorrow, we'll think about what to do next. Sophie nodded, looking relieved. Elizabeth tucked Sophie into bed and quietly left the room. Back in the living room, she stared out the window and let out a deep sigh. The road ahead would not be easy. But Elizabeth was prepared to face any challenge to protect Sophie. As dawn approached, Elizabeth quietly prayed, God, please give us strength. As the morning sun streamed in, Elizabeth had been awake all night. Sophie's shocking confession wouldn't leave her mind. She steeled her resolve. To protect Sophie, I need solid evidence. First, Elizabeth photographed Sophie's injuries. Seeing the small body covered in bruises broke Elizabeth's heart, but she tried to remain calm. Sophie, you've been so brave. Let's keep going for just a bit longer, Elizabeth gently encouraged. Next, Elizabeth contacted a trusted pediatrician and arranged for Sophie to be examined. The doctor meticulously documented Sophie's condition and provided a medical report indicating signs of abuse. While sheltering Sophie at home, Elizabeth began to act cautiously. First, she contacted Jake's family, Sophie's classmate who had helped her. Thank you so much for helping Sophie, Elizabeth expressed her gratitude. Jake's mother explained the situation in detail. We had noticed something was off with Sophie too. But we didn't have any proof. This testimony was a great help in Elizabeth's evidence gathering. Next, Elizabeth visited Sophie's school. In a meeting with Sophie's teacher, surprising information came to light. Mrs. Parker, we've been worried about Sophie too, the teacher began with a serious expression. The frequent absences, sudden drop in grades, and the injuries. We were about to report to Child Protective Services, but Sarah and Mark strongly denied everything. Elizabeth felt a pang in her chest. Why didn't I notice earlier? She felt guilty, but now she had to focus on moving forward. The school provided documents including Sophie's absence records and the teacher's observations. As the evidence mounted, Elizabeth decided to consult a lawyer. In a meeting with Jennifer Thompson, a specialist in child abuse cases, Elizabeth presented all the evidence. Jennifer listened to Elizabeth's story with a serious expression and looked through the documents. Mrs. Parker, this evidence is crucial. We have sufficient grounds to seek custody of Sophie. Elizabeth let out a sigh of relief. What should we do next? First, we'll apply for a temporary protection order from the court. Then, We'll proceed with the legal process to gain custody of Sophie, Jennifer explained. Elizabeth nodded. I understand. I'll do anything for Sophie. As the legal proceedings began, Elizabeth continued to support Sophie. Sophie, Grandma's here with you. I won't let anyone hurt you anymore. Sophie clung to Elizabeth and said in a small voice, Thank you, Grandma. Those words renewed Elizabeth's determination. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. But Elizabeth was prepared to do everything in her power to protect Sophie. As the legal proceedings progressed, the time finally came to confront Sarah and Mark. They arrived at Elizabeth's house, accompanied by a police officer and a child protective services worker. Elizabeth took a deep breath and opened the door. Sarah's eyes were bloodshot, and Mark smelled of alcohol. Mom, what's the meaning of this? Sarah's voice was exhausted. Elizabeth calmly replied, Let's go inside. We need to talk. Once everyone was gathered in the living room, Elizabeth began to speak quietly but firmly. Sarah, Mark, I've heard everything from Sophie. And I've gathered evidence. Why did you hurt Sophie like this? Mark suddenly stood up and shouted, What are you talking about? We were only doing what was best for Sophie. As the police officer restrained Mark, Sarah began to cry. That's not, we. Elizabeth looked straight into Sarah's eyes. I know you had financial problems. But taking it out on Sophie was wrong. Sarah covered her face with her hands and sobbed. We had debts. Mark lost his job. Mark collapsed into a chair, muttering, because of the alcohol. Elizabeth looked directly at Sarah. Sarah, about your childhood. I should have noticed earlier. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you enough back then. Sarah looked at Elizabeth with surprise. Mom. The wounds from back then are being directed at Sophie now. But Sarah, you can break this cycle now. The Child Protective Services worker stepped forward and began to explain the situation matter-of-factly. Our investigation has uncovered evidence of severe child abuse. We're currently applying for a protection order from the court. Sarah looked at Elizabeth with a desperate expression. Mom, what should we do? Elizabeth answered sternly but with love, Sophie's safety comes first. You both need treatment and reflection. Financial problems, alcohol dependence, and past trauma, you need to face all of it. The police officer stepped forward and told Sarah and Mark, We'd like you both to come to the police station voluntarily. Please cooperate with our questioning. Sarah and Mark, seemingly beginning to understand the gravity of their actions, quietly followed the police officer. Left alone in the room, Elizabeth let out a deep sigh. This wasn't the end of everything. But it was certainly a big step towards protecting Sophie and guiding Sarah and Mark in the right direction. Elizabeth headed to Sophie's room. She gently opened the door to find Sophie sitting there with an anxious expression. Sophie, it's okay now. Grandma's here for you. Sophie ran to Elizabeth and hugged her tightly. In this embrace, there was a sense of hope for a new beginning. After months of legal proceedings, the day of the trial finally arrived. Elizabeth held Sophie's small hand tightly as they entered the courtroom. The judge pronounced the verdict with a solemn expression. This court finds the defendants, Sarah Wilson and Mark Wilson, guilty of child abuse. They are ordered to participate in a rehabilitation program and to transfer custody of Sophie Wilson to Elizabeth Parker. Elizabeth let out a sigh of relief. Sophie clung to Elizabeth, whispering, "Grandma." As they were leaving the courtroom, Sarah and Mark approached them. Their expressions were filled with regret. Sarah said tearfully, "Mom, Sophie, we're so sorry. We'll definitely rehabilitate ourselves and wait for the day we can see Sophie again." Mark nodded and added, "We'll never make the same mistake again. Sophie, we'll keep trying until you can forgive us." Elizabeth looked at them with stern but warm eyes. "I'll be watching your efforts. For Sophie's sake, and for your own, do your best." Sophie looked up at her parents and nodded slightly. It wasn't forgiveness, but a small glimmer of hope for the future. From that day, Elizabeth and Sophie's new life began. Elizabeth adjusted her work schedule and devoted herself fully to caring for Sophie. Sophie gradually began to smile again. Her grades at school slowly improved, and her relationships with friends got better. One evening, Sophie came home from school. "Grandma. Look," she said, holding out a test paper. There, in big red letters, was an A+. Elizabeth hugged Sophie and said, "That's wonderful. Sophie, Grandma is so proud of you." Sophie smiled happily and replied, "It's thanks to you, Grandma. You always support me." Elizabeth felt a warmth in her chest. She was filled with gratitude for having overcome the hardships to get to this point. That night, Elizabeth wrote in her diary, "Today, seeing Sophie's smile, I was certain that our decision was right. There will still be challenges ahead. But I believe we can overcome them together." Outside the window, the full moon shone gently. As Elizabeth watched Sophie's sleeping face, she quietly vowed, "Sophie, Grandma will protect your future with all her might." A new morning is about to begin. Many challenges still await Elizabeth and Sophie's life. But if they hold hands together, they should be able to overcome any difficulty. And someday, surely, Sarah and Mark will complete their rehabilitation, and the whole family will be able to spend happy times together. Until that day comes, Elizabeth will live each day